This is where we left off in the last part. We were talking about the difference between the sex chromosomes and the rest. So the XY then becomes the sex chromosomes, and as I was saying, if one has inherits an X from male and female, then you have a female offspring. But if you inherit an X from the female and then a Y from the male, then you have a male offspring. And so the remaining are the remaining 22 are autosomals. And so that's basically because they are similar. And your book actually does a real nice description of saying, with regard to the autosomal chromosomes, I don't want you to think they're exactly the same because you're getting one from your mom, dad, but they line up the same. They're the same length. They basically have, as it says in the book, they stain the same color. The different loci stain the same on each of them, so they present in the same way. They aren't exactly the same because we need to remember there is variety here, but they in essence are very similar. Each of the homologous chromosomes, remember those are the 22 that we were talking about, includes one chromosome from each parent. I think I made that very, very clear. 46 chromosomes in the human soma cell, 2 sets of 23, and 23 and those 23 and 23 line up in this particular karyotype. We ascribe these terms diploid and haploid to understand where we are in this process and what kind of individual or pair or what we're talking about chromosomes. So the autosomal or the somatic cell is going to have a diploid. It's going to be considered a diploid cell. So it's 2N, 2 sets of chromosomes. And then the diploid cell number for humans is 46. 2N equals 46. So 2 times 23, 46 chromosomes in the human. As opposed to, it's interesting, your book talks about dogs having 78. Just because you have more chromosomes, it doesn't make you more sophisticated, although some people may argue with regard to dogs are a little smarter than us, but anyway, that's another thing. But it's just the way that particular species evolved. And so there's a couple of other terms here that come up at about this time. I don't believe I've mentioned, not in this teaching time, the centromere. Remember, the centromere is that waist-like area where the two sister chromatids are attached to each other, and you do have this this capacity for the cohesion, for them to be attached quite tightly to each other. And then you have non-sister chromatids, and they can be similar. What I want to say, they can be similar chromosomes in different pairs. So they're not the same. I guess you might say they're not the same set from that particular soma cell. So you can have non-sister and you can have sister chromatids. And that's about all that's on this. Then on to, with regard to this, how we use these terms, haploid and diploid, when synthesis has occurred, that's when a chromosome has been replicated. And that replication gives rise to these two identical sister chromatids. So you're actually, you can think of yourself as actually doubling yourself. So you doubled yourself. In a gamete, or a sperm or an egg, there's a single set of chromosomes, and that's what makes it haploid. For humans, the haploid number is 23. Each set of 23 chromosomes, 2 autosomal, 1 sex chromosome. Kind of simple, but it's important to keep it straight as you move forward. An unfertilized egg, an ovum in the sex chromosome of X. In the sperm cell, the sex chromosome can be either X or Y, which is why we say the male is what dictates whether the sex of the child. So when you think about it, female XX, that's what she has in her 23rd chromosome. That's the homologous pairs XX, but in the sperm cell, it's going to be an XY. And so what the male does with that XY capacity in the germ cell, it's not actually an autosomal cell that gives rise to the sperm, but it is a cell that actually has a diploid complement of DNA that gives rise to the sperm. We'll talk about that. That's actually the mystery or the story of meiosis. But that sperm cell in the individual sperm cell that is created from the germ cell, or the cell, the precursor cell, you might say, an X or Y can be in there. And then what you're doing here is, it's the first of many times that you'll look at this. You starting out at the male and the female in the gonads. Male gonad is a testy, female ovary, and there are germ cells in there, not germ like, ooh, I can get sick, but we call them precursor cells. They have the diploid complement. They have the 46 chromosome complement. They will replicate, and then in this process called meiosis, they will divide into four daughter cells, each having 23, a haploid complement of DNA material. So 23 individual chromosomes, whether that be in the ovum or the sperm. That then goes through, after meiosis, those two haploid gametes approach each other, and fertilization takes place. And when fertilization takes place, then the 23 from the biological mother in the ovum, 23 from the biological father in the sperm get together. Then you have a diploid again, a diploid zygote. So then you have the full complement of 2N, which equals 46 chromosomes, and then goes through development. Everything after that is mitotic. Everything after that is identical daughter cell to the original zygote with some modifications. You have some differentiation going on, and then develops into a human, whether male or female, with this exception that in the testes you have these specialized cells that can give rise to the gametes. Fertilization is defined, we talked about this already, but it's defined as the union of gametes, male and female. A fertilized egg is called a zygote, and each has one set of chromosomes from each one parent. So we're just defining these terms now that we've already introduced. Then after the zygote is created, produces soma cells by mitosis, developing into an adult. It's a little bit more involved than that, but that's kind of a simplistic version of the story of how a zygote creates an adult, becomes an adult, I guess you might say. In the course of puberty, in the release of hormones, etc., gametes are produced, and those production of gametes then can lead to sexual maturity, which can allow for there to be sperm to be produced and then eggs released by the female. Gametes are the only type of human cells that are produced by meiosis. All the other human cells are produced by mitosis. And then in this process of meiosis, the result is a gamete with that haploid set of chromosomes. then the fertilization fertilization will create that soma cell number, that diploid number. And this alteration of meiosis and fertilization is common in all organisms that reproduce sexually. However, this is what we're calling it, this alteration of meiosis and fertilization. 3 types of sexual cycles differ in timing of meiosis and fertilization. So there are 3 different types that show up in various species. We just talked about the type that shows up in animals. That would be your upper left. You also have in the upper right fungi and some algae. And what you start out with is, it's actually a cycle. And you start out with a haploid unicellular organism. We'll start at the top, which is 1N, haploid. It then can also reproduce in this concept of mitosis. When we think of mitosis, what we're thinking of is it just doubles itself. It replicates itself. It clones itself. And then that can actually have a fertilization process with another haploid unicellular organism and fertilize. That can then create a 2N zygote that then can go through meiosis and then create a haploid complement of unicellular organisms that then can replicate through mitosis again. That's one variation. A second variation of the animal way, the animal fertilization process, is you have a spore, or some plants and some algae, and you start out with a 1N complement. That then can produce gametes. Those gametes then can create a zygote. That zygote then becomes a 2N organism, which we call a sporophyte. That 2N organism, sporophyte, which can go through meiosis and then create spores. These spores are 1N. And one of the unique things about this particular cycle is these cycles can both be multicellular. The one at the top right is multicellular also, sorry. These are also multicellular organisms that in both processes, they're multicellular organisms. The spores can then reproduce mitotically, and then they can get together zygotes. The zygotes can also be a cycle. We call this the alternative cycle with regard to these particular organisms, because each of them are viable cycles of the organism. This actually kind of reproduces what we just talked about. And some plants and algae exhibit alternating generations. That was the term I was trying to use, where the life cycle includes both the diploid and haploid multicellular stage. The diploid organism is called a sporophyte. There's the term. The term showed up on the last one, but it wasn't in the left. Makes haploid spores by meiosis. Each spore grows by mitotic division into a haploid organism called a gamophyte. I didn't introduce that word. And then the gamophyte makes haploid gametes by mitosis, and fertilization then results in a diploid sporophyte. We'll pick this up on the next one.